And welcome to Future Forward. I'm Steve Rosenbaum.
I'm Gene DeRose.
Today, a show in 4 parts. Part 1, addiction, teens, and social media.
Part 2, video games, are they really that dangerous?
Part 3, Apple. Are they losing the education market to Chromebooks?
And Part 4, sex, how the web is changing intimacy for teens.
So we've got a lot to cover. It's going to be an exciting show, and I thought we always start with our loving and hating segment, and then we'll get into the 4 parts. So Gene, what are we loving this week?
So I'm going to do a 15-second recap of something that we talked about earlier, because I think it's important if we're loving or hating to track things. And we talked about something called HQ Trivia in one of our earliest shows, and this was back when they were offering 30,000-ish. Had 30,000 fans tune in to go for $500 or $1,000. This week, they had 2.5 million people live at 9 p.m. playing for $250,000. This is a space that is exploding. From a business point of view, keep an eye on it. And if you're a trivia person, this and a half a dozen apps are amazing out there. So you showed it to me. I'd never heard of it before you keyed me into it. I really enjoyed it. I played it for a couple of weeks, and then I started to see the people that were winning like $1.95. Yes.
And I was like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it changed a little bit because it moved to having people sharing more money. So you'd have people winning $40 or $50, but there might be 15 winners. Then they're doing this thing where a few times a week, they play as many questions it takes to have one winner. So they might go to 20 questions, and that's everyone. One person wins 10 grand or whatever it is. So that's too much on that. But let's get into it.
We're not hating anything this week?
Yes, we are, and I want to start with hating. So what I'm hating this week is something I've hated for a long time, which is weather.com, which historically has been the Weather Channel's online web app presence. And I wouldn't pay any attention except IBM, theoretically in the name of Watson, its AI asset, acquired it probably a year and a half ago. And I expected all sorts of great things, and I'm still hating it. And I mean hating it a lot. And what I really mean is a few things. The interface, the ability to get in and do something is just terrible. To this day, if you type in your zip code as a quick way to accessing your town, it actually then throws you up a list of potential answers that you have to click through. This is like they're breaking 101 rules of interface. 2, the thing is jammed up with bad ads and things that freeze your computer and junk and remnant advertising, and it's really, really terrible. And finally, this is data, and it's a data business, and I love the idea that IBM acquired it, but I'm seeing nothing in the way they're expanding or giving us different windows into it. It feels like it's a non-asset. We're going to show you some pictures in the background because there's also a business-to-business reason that they did this, but it's just terrible.
So just for our listeners to be clear, this is not the Weather Channel, the cable channel. That they spun off. They didn't acquire that. So that's right. That got bought this week by television.
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
That's
so
funny.
that changed hands this week for like $1.95, but we'll set that off. All right. So
weather.com.
So we're going to spend a half hour on teens, and I want to start with this idea, which the New York Times took a pretty good swing at, which is, comparing your kids' use of the phone to cigarettes. And this is a parental cocktail party favorite, right? Oh, cigarettes. We were used to be addicted to cigarettes. Phones are going to go the same way as cigarettes. The Times, in an opinion piece, basically said, just so there was no misunderstanding, the headline is, your kid's phone is not like a cigarette. And I really liked the op-ed because it was not, it wasn't hand-wringy. It was more sensible than that.
Right, and they also, this is a big issue. Common Sense Media has been a big presence for a while now, more than 10 years. Jim Steyer, a billionaire, was behind it. And very wonderful aim, and they've become very powerful as a way of trying to protect and guide parents through issues they might have with children and digital content. I've really had a bone to pick with them for a while, because I think that even though he comes from a theoretically very liberal background, they've been a little too worried about everything, and it's just not responsible to compare this outright to something like cigarette addiction. There's good and there's bad, and I just think what's great about that op-ed is it was balanced.
Which, by the way, which isn't to say that there aren't some behaviors in the way people interact with phones that certainly mirrors what we think of as addiction. I mean,
no, and it is addiction in some cases, but just like everything else, and historically I've always said the internet is the ultimate, and both ends are true. It is deeply addictive in some ways that must be watched, but it is not the same. I'm not sure there's much good about cigarettes or certain, things like that are just poison. And it's just baby out with the bathwater, ironically, since we're talking about kids, to go all that far.
So what do you make of the Washington Post kind of also digs into this with, what parents should do when, rather than just argue that smartphones are destroying their kids. I thought that, again, balanced, thoughtful answers, right? I mean,
yeah.
And by the way, one of the things is it's really easy, as someone who's not the parent of a small child any longer, or small children, It's very easy to look at other parents walking down the street, their kids are holding an iPad, they're on the phone, and kind of roll your eyes. But the reality is, the relationship particularly between small kids and screens is way more complicated than that.
It's complicated beyond belief. There's a balance issue, and you kind of have to look at it from 2 points of view. It's notable and worth saying over and over again that some of the most important founders of technology companies and social media companies don't let their kids touch some of this stuff until they reach a certain age, and we also know of some people that used to work at some of those companies that are now saying bad things. So it needs to be looked at, but it is a balance, and there's plenty of good. I'm on the opposite end of it, even though I'm just as old as you, which is I have a 10-year-old son. But, our issues are equally that he has his head in a book too much as it is into a screen. And so, again, that was a technology, by the way, 150 years ago. But still, it's just something that parents have to manage with eyes wide open and being completely plugged into what's going on and responsible.
All right. I want the Twitterverse to land on Gene's head. Gene DeRose says, kids shouldn't be spending so much damn time with books.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No, when I was growing up, I couldn't stand. Why would you go to a restaurant, say what you wanted, and wait for half an hour for the food? I had my head in a book all the time. So, yeah, it was a little bit of last year's version of Get Off My Lawn.
That's very funny. So then there is this article which I thought was actually complicated. I'm going to have trouble pronouncing the name of the site. It's a Christian media site called Alieta. Did you ALET?
Yeah, that's as best I could do.
Yeah. But their headline, their take is that the real danger for kids today isn't technology, it's psychology. And I read that piece with some cynicism, I have to say.
Yeah. No, I did too. And again, to me, on the face of it, that sounds like what the NRA and Republicans say about the problem with guns isn't guns. It's it's people and managing issues and things like that. And it's one of those things where, like, be that as it may, psychology, everyone could use more therapy and more shrinks or whatever. But that's what I feel. But that's just not the issue. You have to directly address technology issues. And you know what it is? Having a dialogue with your kids. And until they're a certain age, you have to keep an eye on what they're doing. You have to be told if they go somewhere. Their curiosity is part of what you want and what gets them potentially in trouble.
So
talk about that in a few minutes.
So let's get to chapter 2, because I think it's going to be the hairier chapter. Okay,
Yep.
we understand that digital technology is complicated, but let's actually get into video games. So, I mean, and I know that you have kind of a fairly strong take on this.
Well, I mean, my take is that, and it's different than my wife's, by the way. My take is that they're really, really not that bad. There's no difference between social media and other things if it's just your head in a phone doing something completely non-interactive and not together with kids. But if it's video games where you're all sitting on a couch and there are challenges in other kinds of things, and certainly, I have this strong feeling that something like Minecraft is amazing. But again, it's still all in moderation.
So, Minecraft, I read, is now for the first time losing ground to Fortnite.
I've heard that too, and my son and I keep sort of trying to shake our addiction to Minecraft to go kind of check it out a little bit, and yeah, I have heard that. I don't know what, losing ground is one of those qualitative statements that in a juggernaut the size of Minecraft, I suspect what that means is their growth is slowing down or isn't as fast, and losing ground happens when something goes from 0 to not 0. But still, Fortnite is very impressive, as I've heard.
All right, let me prattle on about the standard videos are bad argument, and then you tell me where I'm getting it wrong. So if you take 100 kids and you put them in front of a video game, a first-person shooter video game where they're blowing things up and killing people and there's carnage and horribleness, 99 of those 100 kids can separate fantasy from fiction or from fact, and they play fake violent games and go on to live totally nonviolent or reasonably nonviolent. They're not a school shooter, they're not a mass murderer. But one of those 100 kids, somewhere in their brain, that shooting behavior gets confused with real life, and they start thinking, I'll just spawn another life if I get shot. And it isn't until they cross the line into doing bad things in public that they realize actually that fake guns are very different than real guns.
Look, this is where we get into the nuance and the complexity, even of my point of view on this. And I hate shooter games. I really don't like my son to play them. We're against guns. I can't stand the amount of violence that's in some of these things. So I have 2 points of view on it. One is the research truly is inconclusive, even though I agree with what you're saying. 2, this is something that is a parental decision, because I don't think we can make it illegal or do other kinds of things from a controls point of view. Should there be more warnings, and should there be less kids playing violent shooter death and destruction games? I think so, but I'm not sure where the legal path is to do something about it, because this is kind of the culture we live in. So I'm not in favor of those games.
So let's just play this out for a second. Let's say that for a moment the research becomes conclusive.
Right.
The National Institute of Health says, no, we've done a series of blind tests. We found that kids are far more comfortable acting out violently in real life if they want. Has there ever in the history of free speech and storytelling and media and movies and television, has there ever been a situation where research has proven that something, I guess you could argue cigarettes, right? I mean, you're not seeing a lot of people in primetime television smoking cigarettes anymore. Right.
And and everything that's happened with cigarettes, it's a little different than trying to look at something like media and speech. But I think that there is an analogy. I do think the closest I can come with it is something like hate speech or legal prosecution for hate crimes in digital or media worlds, because I do think you could get to a point where there's really bad things going on there, but it's hard to say they would outlaw those. I mean, it's really, and you have to separate what's legal from what might happen, anyway. Should those games be 18 and over or 21 and over? Maybe that's what would happen at some point. And I would want to follow that path a little bit.
So let me ask you the dad question. So you and your son go to GameStop, and you're standing in front of the, I don't know, what platform do you have at home?
We have an old Wii U, and then we play PC games and iPad and phone.
So all right, so GameStop. So how do you, like, if he's holding 5 games in his hand, because I lived through this, so I remember it quite vividly.
Right.
And 4 of them are like first-person shooters, and then there's like a race car game. Like, do you find yourself going, hey, Donkey Kong is great. Like, play that thing that's a...
Yeah, well, I do, and I have to say, I'm still at the sort of 10-year-old stage where I don't really have to, push that hard or advocate. And my wife and I, we make some of those decisions unilaterally without any help, whereas my 16-year-old daughter, not so much with video games, with other things, will challenge my right to limit her ability to learn about the world. So I'm not sure what that's going to mean. That's a parental management issue, but I certainly will advocate against them. And and I just don't, it's like disliking people that are publishing porn and things like that, where nobody's made it illegal per se, but it's a terrible business that has lots of downside.
So let's get to chapter 3, because chapter 3 is the one that I think is potentially the hardest one to sort. And Apple has always been thought of as the leader in the education technology space. And I mean, we'll start with you as our microcosm. Does your son have does your son get computer technology from school, or do you have a laptop? How does that work?
I think it's probably a little better, since I have one and had 2 high school girls to look at it. And, so we're a Mac family, which is a slightly different thing. And historically, I think one thing we have to sort of look at is that, the education industry hasn't been a real cohesive industry. It's been about, what do state educators do? What hardware do they put in schools? How does curriculum get affected? What do you do about whether, like, Wikipedia is, supposed to be used in research? And, like, there's a bunch of things that are balkanized and don't necessarily have anything to do to each other. And the first thing I just throw out there is that, Apple's historical lead in education is kind of this weird thing that's just had to do with selling more Macs than Windows were sold into some places, than it has had necessarily to do with the opposite, which is, notwithstanding Chrome, my kids have been locked in a Microsoft Office world. That's what dominates things, even though they are all Windows computers that they have. It's moved to Google Drive, Google Chrome, Chromebooks, Google Docs. Those things have taken over what used to just be PowerPoint and Word and Excel. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And so that's kind of the way I feel like Google is probably in the catbird seat. And I'm not sure how much Apple's going to care.
So Apple had a big press event this week in Chicago, and they were going to announce a new low-price education iPad. And there was a lot of anticipation. They didn't do a live stream, which I almost always do. And there's some debate about whether that was to force reporters to have to go to Chicago, or whether or not, because they did it in a school, they couldn't control the access to being able to build a big media center. But everyone I know that went and covered it was pretty underwhelmed.
It feels like something. One of the things Steve Jobs notably did when he came in 97, 98 and, reinvented Apple was he took they diversified ridiculously in product lines, and he just killed a million things and got them down to a little bit of a focus. This almost feels like a remnant of that. I'm not really sure how much more than some people who've been shuttered down into a basement office as a division, that it's something that makes waves in the education world, but I'm not sure if if many people know about it beyond that. So
it's $299 for the device, which is absolutely meant to compete with the Chromebook. Like that's the strategy. But by the time you add the smart keyboard and I guess there's a Apple Pencil that's supposed to be like a kid's version called a Crayon.
Yes, yeah.
And that I think is not Apple proprietary tech, but is coming from a third-party supplier.
So here's what I think is like, I want to get to the education part more core, but I think what's really happening in this particular story is what happens a lot, which is us poor consumers are just pawns in a bullshit war between the powers that be. This is much more about Apple not wanting Google to get a foothold in hardware at a broad level, because the Chromebook is a test run on going bigger and broader into the consumer market, and Apple's always been very concerned and aware that the lower part of the market has been owned by by Windows clones, that you can get really cheap, and now you've got Chromebooks and Linux books and Raspberries and all this other stuff that's happening. So it's a little bit of a hedge by them, but I don't necessarily think it has anything to do with education. And here's what I think is also important. I spent a few minutes this morning with my sister-in-law, who's a high school teacher, and she said they don't let phones or iPads in their school. The kids, they let them kind of keep them in their lockers and look at them between classes and stuff, but they do not want to have any internet turned on at all. She even tried a few things because there was some good mapping or Excel like software, but it backfired on her because some kids were taking pictures of tests and texting them to each other and getting away with it. Of course, the kids were so dumb that she got wind of it, changed the questions, and 5 of these kids put the same answers in anyway and busted themselves. But I think that I don't really know what the answer is going to be to that, and it's ironic that people would be worried about iPhones, but then you've got like these laptops that are getting around too, and they do the same thing.
So I have a confession to make. I've never had a Chromebook in my hand. Have you?
Yes, I have.
How do they feel?
You know what? It's amazing. You think us old timers, it's the equivalent of cord cutting. It's like we think that we couldn't get along without the framework through which we used to operate. But other than going to the web and getting access to some apps, you don't need anything else anymore. You don't need your Outlook or your Windows or your desktop utilities or certainly your file system. Everything's in the cloud. It doesn't feel much different at all, right? We either have our browser on, or we're doing things that are emulated in browsers, or maybe we have a few clients. But it's ironically, it's not a big difference anymore.
So I think Apple has good reason to be concerned. I actually really do.
I do.
And I will tell you, so I had an Apple Air, which I loved, but I was so convinced by what the guys in the stores told me about the Air at end of life, and if I bought one, I'd be having trouble, that I bought an Apple Pro iPad with a keyboard. I didn't buy the Pencil because I didn't think I needed it. The best way I can describe it is it's almost a computer.
No, it's true. And ironically, again, Microsoft lurks in the background, because right when everyone thought they were completely history in terms of advanced hardware, they're the ones that introduced the true hybrids starting about 5 years ago, where you could pull the keyboard off and that was a breakthrough device.
Yep.
And so I completely agree with Apple being potentially in a little trouble. They've kind of they're wearying us a little bit with the amount which they demand that, whether it's with our computers or our phones or our tablets, that we upgrade the darn things every 9 months and pony out another $1,000.
Well, upgrade the software every 30 seconds. All right, so
yeah, I meant hardware.
Yeah. All right, so let's get to chapter 4, because chapter 4 is the one that in some ways is the creepiest.
Sure.
And I almost hesitated to put it in the same show, but then I realized you kind of have to. So chapter 4 is essentially what do we, what we need to worry about in terms of, teens and sex, but on two sides. One in terms of norms and what they're expecting, and then also in terms of exploitation and sexting and all that stuff. I guess two things. The world has changed a lot in the last 15 years in that there never would have been a time when my kids were younger when we would have said, oh, I don't want to know what they're seeing and what they're doing and what they're reading and what they're sharing. But there is part of what's happened with the internet is this sense that at a fairly young age, kids have a sense of privacy. Like I'm going to do stuff on my phone and you're not going to know what it is. Whether that, and a bunch of software companies have made that, why Snap got such a fast start was because you could say bad things and do bad things and be private with your friends in a way, and your parents literally couldn't unlock the door, right? I mean, that was what made Snap better than Facebook.
That's right. And it's what made things, like it. Like what people don't realize, and I know one of the things we're going to talk about as part of this is Instagram, and so I don't want to leap to that yet, but I will say that Instagram, even though it's structured more as a public network like Twitter, if you have kids that are teenagers, you will note that as active as they are, they have private accounts. And so a lot of Instagram operates like Snapchat, which is to say it's closed networks of kids communing with each other or making their own decisions about who can follow them. But that's a little sidetrack.
Well, no, let's stay on that for a minute because I brought up the Instagram article from Tech Advisor, and I think a lot of people think of Instagram as the clean, well-lit, safe version of what kids play with on the internet. And you're saying no, that's not the case.
Well, I'm not saying no, it's not the case. I'm making the analogy that Instagram is much like Snapchat in having broken the model where you have closed universes of things that happen. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad and nasty things. I think Snapchat has much more of a reputation of that and has structural issues why that's the case. Ironically, I'll say this also, so people that don't have kids in the 10 to 18 zone may not know this, that for a lot of people, you couldn't be on Facebook or Snapchat or some of these others until you hit age 13. I don't know what it is today, but Instagram used to be an exception to that. For like 2 years before they were on Facebook and other things, my kids were on Instagram. So it's a little bit of an odd kind of thing. And of course, at 10, 12, 13, we're in the sex mode. But look, this is a deep and complex topic, and all we're going to do now is skate across, some of it. But I just think those are, some of the issues. But you're 100% right that, kids have this issue of being able to do a lot more without people noticing. But I just like we said at the outset about common sense and the cigarette thing, there's an end factor here. And there's never been a time when kids are more also on their guard because one thing could slip out there and it ruins their life forever, or, they can't get a job, or,
But let's talk about that for a second. So in 10 years, let's go way forward into the future.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just going to be everybody has an objectionable tweet and everybody has a picture with a drink in their hand and most everybody has something sexual that's out? Like, does it just all become unimportant?
That's a really good question. First of all, I would say this is the kind of thing we were aware of 10 years ago, and here we are 10 years later. I think people, I think it does circle back to your point that there's a lot less exposure in a world like Snapchat. So a lot of that stuff is happening, and maybe kids feel a little, safer, and we don't even know what's going on. But no, I think that stuff, at least in America, we're a notoriously kind of rigid society compared to Europe and some other places. And so I think that stuff's going to still matter. I don't think that it should. But it is just so hard. I'll also just say this, that there's a dividing line when your kids hit 15, 17, 18, and you've been through this, where you kind of have to let go a little bit, and you have to at the same time decide when your responsibilities end, whether they like it or not, and when they have to start making some of their own decisions, because if they don't get trained in making their own mistakes, but boy, that's a hard thing to do. And, it kind of goes a little beyond even their teen years.
So let's kind of wrap it up with a bit of a summary. We spent the bulk of this podcast thinking about and talking about teens and tech. And what's interesting is, in some ways, I think both of us, are fairly sanguine about it. Like, it is what it is. Phones aren't going away. Computers aren't coming out of schools. Sex on the internet isn't going away. We're going to have to figure out, kind of as a society, how to sort it. But I don't hear a lot in all of the research we did for the show. There's not a lot of legislation. There's not a, stop video games or limit, like it seems like if anything's changed in the last 5 years, it's like, yeah, this is where it is. It's gonna,
Yeah, and I'll also, I completely agree, and I'll also say, to again circle back to common sense and some of the others, that my disappointment with some of these guys is a little bit like where we're at with politics right now, which is I would rather see more highly sophisticated, treat everybody like an intelligent adult, informing of people and getting them plugged into what's really going on and how things work, than to overdo it with hysteria and thumbs up, thumbs down about this particular movie or this particular video game. You and I are lucky because we're plugged into the industry, and so we kind of have at least an offhand knowledge of a lot of the issues. But man, I have really intelligent friends. They don't have a clue what's going on. And so if there's something that could be done, it would be a better effort at helping educate, inform, and kind of keep people a little more aware of the substance of what's going on, rather than value judgments on content and decisions people make. Let people know what things can do.
We are out of time. Next week we'll go back to adult software, and probably politics as well. Until then, future forward. Have a great week. See you next week.
Onward.